What happens when you combine the 2020 coronavirus pandemic, a gaming audience already primed by the well-received Assassin's Creed Odyssey, the highly marketable Viking era fueled by popular TV shows at the time, a new console release, and millions of people stuck at home craving escapism? You get Assassin's Creed Valhalla, arguably the most successful Assassin's Creed game ever released. If you've been around my channel for a while, you know I talk about Valhalla a lot. Though yes, not often in the most positive way. I'll admit some of that was just me trolling, but plenty of my criticism for this behemoth of a game was fair too. Now that we're in 2025 and Valhalla is a complete package, meaning no more updates, no more DLC, and nothing left in the pipeline, we can actually take a step back and look at the full game for what it really is. Kind of like what I did with the Odyssey video, which you guys seem to really enjoy, so thank you for all the love on that one. Before Valhalla came out, I'm not gonna lie, I was hyped. Easily one of my most anticipated games in the entire franchise, and for good reason too. The trailers were incredible, the marketing was next level. I think it was Ubisoft's best marketing campaign ever for an Assassin's Creed game. Plus it was being developed by Montreal with Darby McDevitt as the narrative director, so everything was pointing towards something amazing. But when the game finally dropped, and I put over 100 hours into just the base game, I ended up feeling pretty let down. Not because it's a bad game, I don't think Valhalla is bad, it just did not live up to what I was expecting. The story had so many good moments in it, but it dragged on way too long. There's easily 30 to 40 hours of pure filler that doesn't really add anything. That's just padding for the sake of playtime. And for me, the pacing of the story is the biggest flaw here. If there's one thing I value most in an open world single player game or even a linear one, it's the story. That's what needs to be absolutely nailed on. Without a strong story, I lose interest really fast. And yeah, that's definitely a me thing, but it's one of the main reasons why my dislike for Valhalla is so skewed compared to other people's. So now that you know where I stand with Valhalla, I want to take a fresher look at it here in 2025, especially since I started replaying the game earlier this year. I'm going to talk about some things that absolutely nailed and some things that didn't really work, at least from my perspective, and I promise I'm going into this with a fair mindset. I'm not going to let my past frustration with Valhalla cloud my judgment. Let's be objective about it. So without further ado, let's jump into my first major positive about Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So let's start with what I think is one of Valhalla's strongest positives, which is world design. Now, if you watched this video I made a while ago, I actually put Valhalla's open world dead last, and thinking of it now, that's way too low and unfair. Valhalla's world is by no means perfect, let's get that out the way, but it's definitely not the worst. And just to be clear here, I'm talking about how it looks and how it feels visually, not how fun it is to explore, because that's a whole different topic and one that's not as positive. But from a purely visual standpoint, this game is stunning, you can't deny that. I mean, right from the beginning of the game in Norway, you're hit with this absolutely breathtaking sense of scale. Off in the distance, you'll see snow-covered mountains with the northern lights cutting across the horizon. I've always thought that Norway honestly might be my favorite part of the entire game's exploration, purely because of how serene yet brutal it feels. Is it crazy to say if Valhalla had been set entirely in Norway, I probably would not have complained. Imagine they made Norway bigger and the game had a clear focus in Norway. Now that's an idea to take into consideration. Anyway, once we're done in Norway, we then make the journey to England, and while it's a very different kind of beauty, it still feels lived in and atmospheric. For when this game is set, so that's around 870 AD, I think it does a great job trying to capture what England was like back then. Of course, it is quite hard to tell because it was so long ago, and I don't think there's much source material to go off, unlike, recent time periods such as Unity's French Revolution or the Victorian London in Syndicate. So from what is in Valhalla, the world design is top tier. There's plenty of what you'd expect. So you've got a lot of forests, you've got swamps, you've got Roman ruins too, which are actually poking through the Anglo-Saxon settlements. It all feels like this perfect idea of past mythology and the history of this time period. Out of the 14 mainline Assassin's Creed games out there currently are right now, I would genuinely say the atmosphere of Valhalla's world is definitely within the top 3, because how else can you depict such a miserable and depressing time period? Valhalla knows how. Even when it's raining, it's foggy and it's grey. When it's sunny, which is quite rare, it's blue and bright. And the same goes for snow, the same goes for mist. you name it. I love how dramatic each type of atmospheric look is. When it comes to the cities and towns in Valhalla, it's quite hit and miss, because while the game is mostly about open countryside and, you know, the sporadic nature of random settlements, there are some urban locations that really stand out. Now, not every city or town in Valhalla is memorable, let's get that clear. A fair few of them do feel a bit copy-pasted. Same churches, same street layout, same, you know, everything you've seen a dozen times before. And to be honest, coming from earlier Assassin's Creed games that were built around dense urban cities, Valhalla's towns can sometimes feel like they're set dressing instead of living, breathing ones. But the ones that do stand out, they're genuinely great. I mean, take Jorvik for example. This is my personal favorite city in the entire game. It's set in what is now modern day York, and it's this fascinating kind of clash of Norse and Anglo-Saxon culture. You can see the snowy rooftops, there's like Roman ruins that are just kind of blending together with the Viking style wooden structures, and even the crowd density, it feels alive. You know, funnily enough, even though this game is a massive open world RPG game, I've always felt that Jorvik gave me old school Assassin's Creed 1 vibes, like the cities in the very first game. It has verticality, it has landmarks you can navigate by, and hey, even the questline in Jorvik is one of the better ones in the entire game, which is saying something. Then you've got London, which is this crumbling Roman city slowly being reclaimed by the Anglo-Saxons. Now, it's not the giant metropolis you might expect, it's more of a decayed husk of what it used to be, but that's exactly what makes it interesting. Other towns like Winchester or Lincoln also have the appeal too. I mean, Winchester is one of those locations in the game that you can definitely tell is full of churches and religious sites. While Lincoln, I mean, look at this is Lincoln. It's got a very uphill layout and it makes it feel a bit larger and more confusing than it actually is. And hey, even smaller towns like Gloucester stand out with their, pagan vibes. I mean, you can see festivals and partying around this place. And it doesn't stop there. Asgard, while obviously not aiming for realism, is gorgeous in its own right. Yes, it does completely shift away from the grounded tone of Valhalla's England, and it takes us to, I mean, bloody Asgard. It feels like one of those moments where Ubisoft really flexed their environmental artist, don't you think? I will say though, as nice as Asgard is, you can still see that it's clearly the assets of England. I feel like its environmental artists could have gone harder, but they didn't. Now, like I said, how fun it is to explore these places is a different discussion, because as beautiful as England, Norway and Asgard are, the actual content in them can feel a bit empty or repetitive. But if we're talking pure aesthetics, Valhalla absolutely nails it. It may not be the most historically accurate recreation of 9th century England, but it does exactly what it's supposed to. It makes you want to step into that Viking fantasy. Assassin's Creed, not quite, but Vikings, fuck yeah. Let's be honest, Assassin's Creed Valhalla's story is not that bad, even though I clown on it a lot. But the way it's told really drags it down. There are parts I genuinely enjoyed, especially the big moments that felt like they actually mattered. Anything involved the Sigurd kidnapping, the Hidden Ones, or the deeper Assassin Templar lore had me hooked. But for every important, meaningful arc, there were hours of filler that just killed the pacing. The biggest culprit is the endless alliance building across England. Why did I need to be best friends with every single kingdom in the country? Half of these arcs had nothing to do with the main story. Some of them were fun, sure. Shropshire was great and Jorvik's story felt interesting and relevant, but a lot of them felt like Ubisoft were just padding out the game. They'd work so much better as optional side stories, letting us choose which ones we actually cared about instead of just forcing every single arc into the main story. And because you're constantly being yanked away from the main plot, there's no real sense of urgency. I mean, Sigurd gets kidnapped and you would think rescuing him would be the driving force of the whole game, but nope. Instead of going straight after him, you're suddenly helping some random Thane in Essex solve his marriage problems or picking up who should run a shire. It completely kills the momentum, and by the time you finally get back to the main story, you almost forget why it was important in the first place. What makes this worse is that Valhalla does not give you a choice in how you engage with these arcs. If you want to progress the story, you have to pledge every region, even the ones that feel completely disconnected from the bigger picture. Imagine if the Sigurd arc was a tight 25 to 30 hour main storyline with all the filler treated as optional content. You'd still have the same amount of game, but the story would feel so much more focused and impactful. The characters suffer from this pacing too. Some allies are memorable for a single arc but then disappear into the void, only to randomly randomly show up again for a big moment that barely lands because you forgot who they were. By the time the final battle rolls around, you're left with this anticlimactic feeling, like all those alliances you spent dozens of hours forging didn't really pay off in any meaningful way. I've always believed that Valhalla has a solid core story buried under all of that bloat. It just needed to be shorter and less padded out. Cut the filler and this would easily be one of the best Assassin's Creed narratives in years. Staying on the topic of the story, when it comes to Valhalla's modern day, I actually think it was the best we've had since the Desmond era. That might not sound like a high bar, but it genuinely surprised me how invested I was in Layla's story, and more importantly in where things were heading with Basim. For the first time in years, the modern day felt like it actually mattered. Seeing the return of Sean and Rebecca was a nice touch too. Sean was still his usual snarky self. I mean, honestly, he's the best modern day character outside of Desmond, while Rebecca felt oddly toned down and felt more depressing, which was a bit disappointing. God knows what happened to her during that time. But hey, at least they felt like familiar faces anchoring the modern day again. The ending of Valhalla's modern day was actually pretty intriguing. Layla's sacrifice and Basim's return to the real world opened so many exciting possibilities. I mean, ending with Basim, low-key reincarnated, loose in the modern day. That's one of the boldest ideas we've had in a while. And then you toss in the ezio Desmond moment, where he's this digital consciousness exploring infinite timelines. That had me thinking, finally Ubisoft is doing something fun. Nope, they did not. All of that potential was just dropped entirely. Basim was hyped up as this mysterious wildcard, yet Mirage completely abandoned any meaningful modern day story. And Shadows, I mean, it's got a horrendous modern day story. So Valhalla set up a huge fascinating direction, only for Ubisoft to shrug and walk away from it. It's classic Assassin's Creed modern day. Every time it gets interesting, they stop. And don't even get me started on the Animus anomalies. They were tedious platforming segments that existed purely as filler, like extra homework just to unlock a tiny bit more ezio lore. Ezio lore that I'll discuss a bit later on when talking about the ezio. Still, I want to believe there's hope. Darby McDevitt, who really understands the franchise's lore, is involved with Assassin's Creed Hexe. If anyone can bring the modern day back to being truly compelling, it's him. Valhalla's modern day proved it can be interesting again. It just needs somebody willing to commit. And we know Ubisoft don't have many good writers anymore. In fact, apart from Darby McDevitt, who on earth is left within the Assassin's Creed franchise that's a good writer? Even the ezio story of Valhalla I thought was handled surprisingly well. I thought Assassin's Creed Odyssey did a great job with the ezio lore, but there were times where it did get a bit too into its mythological aesthetic. But Valhalla actually clarified the ezio's place in the lore while tying it intelligently to the Norse mythology. I've always perceived Valhalla's ezio lore as cultural memories of real ezio figures and then even showing their conflicts leading up to the Great Catastrophe. The biggest positives for me was how the game revealed the Aesir and Jotun factions as two opposing ezio groups, each with their own agenda. So Odin wasn't a stereotypical Norse god. He was an ezio desperate to survive the coming catastrophe, willing to betray allies and make some dodgy decisions for his own survival. Loki, meanwhile, became far more sympathetic when you see his motivations. I like that he's not some cartoon villain, but somebody rebelling against Odin's hypocrisy and trying to save his child with Alethea, aka Angraboda. Even Fenrir, who we've always seen outside of Assassin's Creed as a mythic wolf. Instead, in Valhalla, he was reframed as something more nuanced, kind of a hybrid or creation that threatened Odin's plans. But what really worked is how well Valhalla used Eivor's visions as the filter. So you're not literally in Asgard, you get drugged in Valka's hut, and then you see how Eivor's mind interprets Odin's ezio memories, wrapped in Norse imagery that only Eivor would understand. Then if you complete the Animus anomalies, you see the real version of those events, stripped off the mythic filter showing advanced ezio technology and the reality of their society. I felt like that was such a clever way of Ubisoft tying in the science fiction side of the game while also staying grounded. The imprinting process was another fascinating idea. So unlike the sages from the earlier games, which felt a bit confusing at times, the Aesir created a more refined way to preserve their consciousness. Odin living on through Eivor, Tyr through Sigurd, and Loki fully resurfacing in Basim felt like a natural evolution of concepts introduced as far back as Assassin's Creed 2. It made the reincarnations meaningful instead of just being random. And Darby McDevitt's writing tied it all back to the earlier lore beautifully. The references to Juno, the references to Aita, and even the Capitolone Triad showed how interconnected all the pantheons really were. It was the first time in years the ezio felt like a living fractured civilization. Honestly, Valhalla restored my faith that the ezio plotline could be smart when handled with care. If Assassin's Creed Hexe follows this same approach under Darby McDevitt's guidance, we might even get deeper into the philosophical side of the issue, and hey, what about their downfall? What if the modern day of Assassin's Creed Hexe shows us that? You know, I asked Darby McDevitt recently about an update for Assassin's Creed Hexe, and are you ready for what he said? It's crazy. He said, nah. Let's talk about the parkour and stealth in Valhalla, and unfortunately this is where the cracks really start to show. Now, Valhalla might be the top pick out of the RPG trilogy, so that's Origins, Odyssey and Valhalla, but that doesn't automatically mean it nails the parkour aspect. Honestly, none of the three really shine in this department, and they're all kind of on the same level when it comes to movement. In truth, I said pretty much everything I needed to about the parkour back in my Odyssey video, and it still applies here, just with slightly less finesse and a more heavy feeling, so there's not much to add. But the little that is different, it's mostly worse. Parkour in Valhalla exists not because the game needed it, but because Assassin's Creed is written on the cover. It's a legacy system stapled onto a game that clearly does not care about it. At best, it's functional. At worst, it actively gets in your way. I mean, what can I say about parkour in this game that we don't already know? Valhalla does make some small improvements, like reintroducing sprinting, which finally, and also adding a slide mechanic, which is fine I guess, but you'll never use it to be honest. And it doesn't really add much to the flow of freerunning. The movement is just heavy and unresponsive, and the design of the environments just don't encourage fluidity. In fact, if anything, it just punishes it. Compared to the vertical playgrounds of earlier games, Valhalla feels a bit grounded, literally. Most of the game takes place in the countryside of 9th century England, which means a lot of flat terrain, a lot of cliffs and the occasional monastery. Valhalla tries to simulate weight and momentum, but instead of making you feel grounded, it makes you feel clunky. You will lose speed by just vaulting over certain objects. You'll get stuck on geometry that you shouldn't, and worst of all, you'll experience that infuriating short drop animation constantly, which is an uninterruptible fall that kills your momentum and often your patience. Especially when you're chasing those, you know, tattoo paper things that feel like they were designed by the worst types of people. Then there's the stealth. Now, to be fair, Valhalla does have more stealth mechanics than Odyssey and Origins, which isn't really saying much, but it's something. You've got a few basic tools, some environmental options here and there, and technically the game does let you sneak around, but the problem is it's not built for it. Let's be completely honest, this is a game about Vikings, brutal, loud, axe-swinging Vikings, so trying to play stealthy feels totally at odds with what the game's actually encouraging you to do. Now, sure, you can try to play like an assassin, but it's underdeveloped and, you know, kind of frustrating. Once you're detected, the game immediately pushes you into combat and there's almost no way to reset. Assassinations share a button with light attack, so congratulations, your silent kill attempt just triggered combat with an entire bloody group of soldiers. Social stealth does return, you know, there's crowds, benches, hoods, but it's all so bare bones that it might as well not exist. You know, I could not find a single crowd to blend in to get footage in my 20 or 30 minutes of fast traveling everywhere. That's how little of it is in this game, so here's some trailer footage instead. Now, you have to hold a button to blend in with crowds, but good luck matching their walking speed. You'll either lag behind them or awkwardly bump into them. It feels more like a gimmick than an actual system. Same thing with the benches, same thing with sitting at tables. Gone are the days of casually slipping into a seat to vanish. Now it's just hold down a button and it feels so forced. When it comes to AI, it's questionable at best. It's a shallow callback to older Assassin's Creed games with none of the design that made it work. One tiny movement and boom, you're spotted. Once that happens, it's hard to sneak back into bushes. You're locked into combat whether you like it or not. The old 3-stage detection system is missed here. Guards used to get suspicious gradually. Now they just instantly want to kill you. So yeah, parkour and stealth, two things that this game does a bad job at. But on the flip side, the combat system and the loot system are two similar things that I think Valhalla does a fantastic job at. Let's start with the loot, because after coming off Odyssey, I was dreading the same rinse and repeat grind of picking up hundreds of nearly identical swords, bows and helmets. But Valhalla did something smart. It trimmed the fat and made each gear piece feel intentional. Every weapon or armor set is handcrafted with care, with unique appearances, stats and even lore tied into them. I don't know about you guys, but I was surprisingly interested to discover a new new weapon because I knew it was going to matter. That alone gave me more incentive to explore and invest in my gear. The combat is also a standout. Before Assassin's Creed Shadows came out, I would have said Valhalla had the best combat in the entire franchise. Now it comfortably holds second place, but it's still a fantastic system. It's very weighty, brutal, and actually satisfying, and that applied with pretty much every weapon type in the game. There is also some real depth here too, with a mix of light and heavy attacks, some weapon specific combos, and abilities I feel impactful but not too overpowered. I mean, take a look at this. I had no idea it was possible to counter this big guy who's throwing giant rocks. People love to say the old Assassin's Creed games had the better combat, but let's be honest. As somebody who started playing Assassin's Creed back in 2009, the counter kill system was flashy but very shallow. It was one button murder with zero challenge. Yes, it was fun to watch, but it was not engaging enough to play. I'm gonna say it, nostalgia is clouding a lot of people's judgment when it comes to old gameplay versus new gameplay. Now, yes, the enemy AI is kind of a joke, and that does make things easier than they should be, but it does not change the fact that the core combat loop is fun and mechanically solid. Now, one thing I will say was done terribly was the skill tree, because what on earth even is this? The skill tree in Valhalla is a lot. Like a lot. At first it seems kind of exciting, right? You're unlocking constellations of abilities following these mysterious glowing pathways, and there's a sense of discovery. But that interesting charm fades very fast once you realize most of what you're unlocking is just minor stat boosts like plus 1.7% melee damage or plus 2.4% stealth resistance. Seriously, it's the kind of stuff that should just happen automatically when you level up, not something you have to manually assign every time. The skill tree tries to give the illusion of choice by dividing things into bear, wolf and raven paths, but the truth is you'll just end up unlocking all of them eventually anyway, so there's no real build diversity, just a bloated, convoluted mess of nodes that you slug through to get to the handful of useful skills. And when it comes to those useful ones, you'll probably reach them early on. After that, assigning points feels like a chore. The UI does not help either. The fog of war layout means you often have no idea what you're working towards. You'll spend time unlocking a random path only to find it leads to another 2% range damage, and not the cool ability you were hoping for. It's so unbelievably overly complicated, and worst of all pointless, since we're all gonna end up with the same stuff in the end. Now, on a more positive note, the DLCs, or rather the Siege of Paris and the Wrath of the Druids. I wouldn't say Dawn of Ragnarok, but the other two were surprisingly interesting. I made a video ranking every DLC in the franchise, and I placed Siege of Paris and Wrath of the Druids quite high up, because I thoroughly enjoyed my time with them, a lot more than the base game story. Now, I'll not go too in depth here because I've already spoken about them in depth in my DLC ranking video, so check that out if you want to hear my in-depth thoughts. They're not masterpieces by any stretch, but for the price and the fresh settings, they're decent expansions to sink into. Wrath of the Druids starts with Eivor heading to Ireland to help out his cousin Barrett, who's somehow the king of Dublin now. The story delves into, you know, the Irish politics and religion with a side of folklore, including the mysterious Children of Danu cult. Now, while the setup sounds like more of the same, go here, solve local problems, assassinate some bad people, it's actually elevated by the atmosphere and characters. The setting of Ireland is quite lush, with green landscapes that may look a bit too similar to England, but the mystical elements like werewolf-like enemies and an ancient druid magic give it its own identity. The standout character here is Ciara, or Kiara, who's a bard with solid backstory, actual depth, and even a romance plot that doesn't feel too forced. Now, I'm not gonna lie, I'd trade her for Randvi any day. The cult hunting gameplay is also a highlight. Think Order of the Ancients, but better integrated and more satisfying. That said, the DLC does have the typical Ubisoft bloat, like the role demands and trading posts, which just feel like chores, but still it's a solid if flawed expansion. Siege of Paris on the other hand feels like Ubisoft finally remembered that they make Assassin's Creed games. The setting, which is war-torn France here, feels so much darker and more desperate than the rest of Valhalla. The actual politics here is way better than any of the base game, and it's centered around Charles the Fat, and the story has a lot of mystery to it. What really stands out though are the black box missions, which is a welcome throwback to classic Assassin's Creed gameplay. You actually get to be stealthy and assassinate, and choosing stealth unlocks unique scenes and kills. You know, this DLC felt like Ubisoft's quiet response to fans who've missed the series' roots. The DLC is not without its flaws as expected. You know, there's repetitive rebel missions, forgettable characters like Toka and Siegfried who exist solely to be annoying, but it ends on a strong note with a very clever final boss fight against Charles the Fat. Now, compared to everything else Valhalla has to offer, Siege of Paris is easily the most assassin-like part of the game. So yeah, both DLCs have their ups and downs, but they manage to outshine the base game in different ways. If you're burned out on Valhalla, these two might actually rekindle a bit of the fun. And now to end on a more neutral note, and no, it won't be about microtransactions. Everything I said about Odyssey's microtransactions applies for Valhalla too, so there's no point repeating myself. I want to end by discussing the side content in Valhalla and how a lot of them felt like filler, but there's also some good ones. Now that's Ubisoft's biggest weakness in open world games, which is meaningful content. We know that Assassin's Creed Valhalla has a ton of it, and I mean a ton. On paper that sounds amazing. More content, more value, right? But once you actually dive into it, it very quickly becomes clear that most of it exists just to pad out the map and inflate your playtime. It's a case of quantity over quality, and sadly the majority of it ends up feeling like filler. Let's start with the world events. Now these are Ubisoft's answer to traditional side quests, and while some of them are meant to be funny or random as hell, like the naked guy hiding people's clothes, most are just shallow 1-minute distractions that leave no lasting impact at all. In fact, I can barely remember any of them. There's no quest log whatsoever, so it's just fast, often nonsensical interactions that feel more like random skits than actual stories. And once you've done 5 or 6 of them, you start to see the formula repeating. Then we've got the mysteries. These are a mixed bag. Some are interesting, like the Daughters of Lerion boss fights or the Lost Drengir duels, but others like stacking rocks just feel tedious. Offering altars, for example, are especially annoying, asking you to bring very specific items that require grinding, all for the amazing reward of 1 skill point. And don't even get me started on the collectibles. Wealth and artifacts are scattered everywhere, behind locked doors, in caves, or worse, hidden behind yet another bard from the other side door. You will definitely spend more time searching for the entrance or an explosive jar than actually enjoying the reward, and 9 times out of 10 it's a generic ingot. Now to be fair, there are a few highlights. Hunting legendary animals or zealots can be super fun, especially if you're into challenging combat. Some mysteries and assassination targets have cool lore attached, but for the most part, Valhalla's side content feels like filler, aka a checklist of tasks designed to waste time instead of making your experience entertaining. So yeah, that's Assassin's Creed Valhalla in 2025. Flaws, strengths and everything in between. It's a game that I've had a very mixed journey with over the years. At launch, I was not sold at all. It felt bloated, directionless in parts, and it left me let down after being so hyped. But now with all of the content out and a lot more time giving me some perspective, I could also say Valhalla did a lot of right too. Of course, there's still stuff that bugs me. You know, story pacing, the stealth, skill trees and some of the filler content that did not need to be there. But in the end, Valhalla is a game that represents both the best and worst of modern Assassin's Creed. Anyway, those are just my thoughts. Let me know down below what you think in the comments, whether you love it, hate it or landed somewhere in the middle like me. So yeah, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.